Hi, today we will talk about international ethics guidelines and relevant regulations. We will zero in the case of access to medicines in low and middle income countries. So in 2012, Doctors Without Borders released the following. New therapeutic products address only 3.8% of neglected diseases, even though these diseases account for 10.5% of the global burden of disease. This is scandalous, and it's scandalous because it shows the gravity or the current state of distributive injustice in terms of global access to medicines, global access to therapeutic products. Um, this is something that we will continue to explore, or that we would want to explore a little deeper in today's discussion. What is the state of, and how does the whole patenting regime contribute to this lack of access? But before we do that, I want to show to you two relevant guidelines. The first is the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. So what does the Universal Declaration say in terms of responsibilities towards access? So Article 14 of the Declaration states the following: taking into account that the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. Progress in science and technology should advance access to quality healthcare and essential medicines, especially for the health of women and children, because health is essential to life itself and must be considered to be a social and human good. Right, so the declaration clearly states that progress in science and technology, which most definitely includes pharmaceutical development and production, or uh, or health research in general, including, for example, clinical trials, drug trials, trials on devices. Yeah, so these activities should advance access to healthcare and essential medicines. What is meant by essential medicines? We will look into the definition of essential medicines shortly, but before we do that, I want to show you the second guidelines, and this is the human rights guidelines for pharmaceutical companies in relation to access to medicines. Right. Now, this guideline is very clear in stating that the primary responsibility in promoting good health and increasing access to medicines belongs to the state. That is, it is the primary duty of governments to ensure that the citizens have access to medicines and have access to healthcare, right? But at the same time, the guideline also clearly specifies that pharmaceutical companies have a responsibility in terms with regard to access to medicines. Yeah. So the guideline states pharmaceutical companies, including innovator, generic, and biotechnology companies, have human rights responsibilities in relation to access to medicines. And then it says that enhancing access to medicines has the central place in the societal mission of pharmaceutical companies. Right? First, it states that pharma companies are responsible or have their share of responsibility in terms with regard to access to medicines. And then it then further says that that central to the societal mission of pharma companies is enhancing access to medicines. It did not say, it didn't just say a production of pharmaceutical products or development of pharmaceutical products. No, it says that central to the societal mission of pharma companies is enhancing access to medicines. Yeah. And Article 1 then goes on to specify how pharma companies should do that. First, it says that pharma companies should adopt a human rights policy statement, right? And that enhancing access to medicines or access to medicines should be integrated in and the pharma company's strategies, programs, projects, and other activities. Yeah. Now, going back to essential medicines. As we've said, we have to define it. Essential medicines are those that satisfy the priority healthcare needs of the population. They are selected with due regard to public health relevance, evidence on efficacy and safety, and comparative cost effectiveness. Essential medicines are intended to be available within the context of functioning health systems at all times in adequate amounts in the appropriate dosage forms with assured quality and adequate information and at a price the individual and the community can afford. So it says first it has to be available at all times in adequate amounts in the appropriate dosage forms. At the same time, it also has to be accessible at a price the individual and the community can afford. Right? Essential medicines must be both available and accessible. Now, but what is the state of affairs with regard to essential medicines? Well, today, 1/3 of the world's population lacks access to essential medicines. In the poorest parts of Africa and Asia, this figure rises to half of the population. This is a terrible state of affairs. So remember, we're not talking about all drugs. We're just talking about essential medicines, medicines that are in the essential medicines list, right? And even there, a third to half of the world's population lack access to these medicines. And most of the time, the reason for this lack of access is actually cost. Since cost is usually borne out of pocket by households, with almost 10% of expenditures of LMIC households allocated to medicines, it's very clear that costing has a lot to do with, or is a big contributor to, this sorry state of affairs, right? It's not uncommon for families in low and middle income countries to be put into poverty because they need to purchase medicines, right? And this terrible situation, just paints this picture of why or what the state of affairs is when it comes to accessing medicines, essential medicines or otherwise. Now, according to Obi, there are 3 factors that contribute to lack of access to essential medicines in low and middle income countries. There might be more, though he presents 3 factors. The first is poverty and inadequate health infrastructure. According to Obi, there are 3 factors that contribute to lack of access to essential drugs in low and middle income countries. The first is poverty and inadequate health infrastructure. Poverty, quite self-explanatory, but inadequate health infrastructure, this could be because, well, the governments have insufficient funds or funds are misappropriated. Right? Instead of it going to health, it goes to somewhere else, right? Second is meager investment on research and development by pharma companies on diseases of poverty. We saw this at the very beginning when the Doctors Without Borders specified how little of new drugs are in fact dedicated to addressing neglected diseases. And third would be adverse effects of strict enforcement of patent protection. And so this is something that I wish that I would want us to go through now. When we talk of patents, we think of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And when we think of the World Trade Organization, we necessarily think about the TRIPS agreement, right? The WTO is the international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. It's composed of 164 um, member states. Now, member states or member countries of the WTO must adhere to all WTO agreements. They cannot pick and choose. It's a lock, stock, and barrel situation. Yeah? So members cannot choose to be party to some agreements, but not to others. Once a country becomes a member of the WTO, then that also means they accept all the agreements attached to it. Now, of all the WTO agreements, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, also called TRIPS, has the greatest impact on the pharmaceutical sector and access to medicines. It has been in force since 1995 and is the most comprehensive multilateral agreement on intellectual property, including those for patents. Just now, before we move on, we need to define what patents are. So what are patents? A patent is it's an exclusive right. Exclusive right to what? An exclusive right for an invention, and an invention of what? Of either a product or a process. And now this invention, which is either a product and or a process, provides something new, something novel, a novelty, a new way of doing something, or offers a new technical solution to a problem. Now, going back to the WTO and the TRIPS agreement, the TRIPS agreement requires member countries to make patents available for any invention, whether products or processes, in the fields of technology without discrimination, subject to the normal test of novelty, inventiveness, and industrial applicability. Okay. Now, the term of protection of a patent is 20 years. That means the duration of a patent is 20 years. So recall that a patent may either be of a product and or a process, right? Now, what does this entail? The exclusive rights that must be conferred by a product patent are the ones of making, using, offering for sale, selling, and importing for these purposes. So everything that you can do to a product, right? Making, using, offering for sale, selling, and importing for these purposes. While a process patent protection must give rights not only over the use of the process, but also over products obtained directly by the process. Right? Patent owners shall also have the right to assign or transfer by succession, so they can transfer the patent, they can assign the patent, um, and to conclude licensing contracts. Okay. Now, when we talk about patenting and we talk about use of patents, we also hear a lot about compulsory licensing. What do you mean by compulsory licensing? Compulsory licensing means, well, assigning the rights to a patent by the member state, by the government, to another party other than the patent holder. So this is compulsory, meaning that the patent holder does not have the choice, on what happens to the rights to a patent or to the use of the patent, right? Now, compulsory licensing and government use without the authorization of the right holder are allowed, but are made subject to conditions aimed at protecting the legitimate interests of the right holder. Right, so compulsory licensing, in fact, is allowed, but then there are measures to ensure that the rights of the right holder are still upheld. Governments are authorized to issue a compulsory license for a patented drug without the permission of the patent holder whenever it can justify on the grounds of public interest, such as national health emergency. So here, what we see are flexibilities. Yeah. So a while ago, we saw that patents give exclusive rights to the patent holder, but then in certain situations, of public interest, such as, for example, if there's a national health emergency, then governments are authorized to use the flexibilities, to impose, for example, a compulsory license. And when they impose and when they grant compulsory license, then other individuals or companies would have the right to use the patent, either to produce a product, to sell a product, so on and so forth. Okay. Patent may be broken by the member nation, and a third party may be authorized to produce a generic version of a patented drug. Okay. Now, provisions of parallel imports in the interest of public health and social welfare are also present. But first, what do you mean by parallel imports? It means importing cheaper priced patented drugs without any restrictions. Okay, so as you can see, compulsory licensing, parallel imports, all of these are flexibilities, TRIPS flexibilities, where member states are given the right to such flexibilities for situations required by public interests. Yeah. Now, as you can see, these statements can be mm, can be a little bit vague, right? So this whole issue of public interest, national health emergency, social welfare, these brought in a lot of questions and discussions. So in 2001, uh, well, the ministerial declaration of the WTO, I'm sorry, in 2001, um, the WTO had a meeting in Doha, which resulted in the Doha Declaration. Here, the WTO members adopted a special ministerial declaration at the WTO Ministerial Conference to clarify ambiguities between the need for governments to apply the principles of public health and the terms of the TRIPS. Right? So recall that this springs from the whole question of the use of the TRIPS flexibilities. In particular, concerns had been growing that patent rules might restrict access to affordable medicines for populations in developing countries in their efforts to control diseases of public health importance, including HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. So, in the Doha Declaration, the conditions for granting compulsory licenses were clarified. Yeah. First, it says that it's a case-by-case determination by the member states. So, second, there's a need to demonstrate that there was a prior but unsuccessful negotiations with the patent owner for a voluntary license. That is, that the patent owner just voluntarily gives or assigns or gives the patent away, right? And that there must be payment of adequate remuneration to the patent holder. However, if a compulsory license is given by the government during a national emergency, number two is waived. That is, there's no need to demonstrate that there was an unsuccessful negotiation with the patent owner. TRIPS leaves members full freedom to stipulate other grounds, such as those related to non-working of patents, public health, or public interests. Yeah. The Doha Declaration states that each member has the right to grant compulsory licenses and the freedom to determine the grounds upon which such licenses are granted. Right? So this all sounds very good because it gives a lot of flexibility. Right? So in principle, if a member state thinks that patents must be made, that patent for specific drugs must be made compulsory because there's an epidemic or there's not necessarily an epidemic, but a public health concern, right? Then such flexibilities are available for them to use. But then we question, in spite of several epidemics and now the world also experienced a pandemic, why was there such limited use of compulsory licensing? And the answer would be, well, one of the answers would be bilateral agreements, such as, for example, the agreement of low and middle income countries with the United States. And again, according to Obi, in spite of initiatives to promote universal access to antiretroviral drugs, especially for developing countries, recent U.S. negotiated trade agreements threaten to undermine these gains in improving access to antiretroviral drugs. MSF writes, one by one, countries are trading away their people's health in free trade agreements with the US. These countries are being pushed to accept extremely restrictive intellectual property provisions that could put an end to competition from generic medicine producers and to countries' ability to make use of existing safeguards against patent abuse. Right. So one of the reasons would be bilateral relations. Right. So what in principle is available, in fact, is very difficult to use because it would compromise agreements such as this one. So then we ask, what is the state of affairs? So we saw what the state of affairs was in 2012. Now this is 2016 information or data from Access to Medicines Index. Access to Medicines Index looked into 850 pharmaceutical products and found out that only 5% of the 850 are can be considered how do you, can be considered as well as equitable, right? Only 44 products of the 850 have a strategy that meet the criteria looked for by the index. And what criteria are we referring to, right? That products are priced equitably, including with price differentiation within countries, including in at least one priority country, and with at least one socioeconomic factor taken into account. So, of all the products looked at by the Access to Medicines Index, only 5% of them were equitably priced. That is priced with access in mind, right? Access by considering um, a price differentiation, differences in capacity in purchasing power, of the population. And by population here, at least it should be one of the priority countries, taking into consideration at least one socioeconomic factor. Right. So to this date, we still suffer not necessarily from availability of products, of pharmaceutical products, but most definitely we're suffering still from accessibility of these products. Now, if access remains an issue, brought about by the patenting regime. Another issue that should come to our attention is the issue of responsiveness. But first, what do you mean by responsiveness? Responsiveness refers to how a health product, a pharmaceutical product, for example, responds to the needs of a population. Yeah. So meaning that and when we say response to the need of population, it's probably because it is an unaddressed medical need, an unmet medical need, or it could be because there might be availability but difficulty in terms of access because it's so expensive. So you develop products that probably are as safe and effective, but also is responding to or is reflective of the needs of and the capacity of the population, right? Now, according to WHO Commission, which studied the impact of patents on public health, There's no evidence that the implementation of the TRIPS agreement in developing countries will significantly boost research and development in pharmaceuticals on type 2 and particularly type 3 diseases. Insufficient market incentives are the decisive factor. Type 2 and type 3 diseases refer to neglected diseases which mostly or exclusively occur in poor populations and do not represent market opportunities for commercial companies. Despite the dramatic increase in the protection of medical patents in the last 2 decades, we have not seen a dramatic increase in development of new treatments for neglected diseases. Right. So, um, first is the issue of access, as we saw, but there's also this whole issue of responsiveness. Yeah. So, according to this WHO commission, um, there's no evidence to show that TRIPS will in fact boost research and development activities to address neglected diseases because these neglected diseases occur in countries where commercial opportunities are quite low. That means again in low and middle income countries. Yeah. So. Yeah, so not only is patent making drugs quite inaccessible, it's also quite ineffective in pushing for the development of drugs that respond to healthcare needs. Now, this is a chart from Access to Medicines Index, just to show you what those dots mean. If it's a gray dot, it means it's a high priority, low incentive product gap unaddressed by companies in scope. If it's green, then it's high priority, low incentive product gap that's already addressed by companies in scope. While a blank cell means it's no high priority, low incentive product gap. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of blank spaces, but also a lot of gray dots. And the gray dots outnumber the green dots. So the TRIPS agreement is ineffective in pushing for the development of drugs that are responsive to the needs of LMICs. But neither is it also effective in pushing for novel drugs. So here, what we see, it says a 12-year analysis of 1,158 new drugs brought to market in Europe shows that only 2% offers a real advance over existing therapies. No real breakthroughs were recorded, and more than half were nothing new, mostly so-called Me Too products that aim to take a share of competitors' market but offer little or no additional therapeutic value for patients. If you look at this, how many of the new drugs, in fact, are novel? If you look into the Bravo scale, it says that from 2009 to 2018, only one is considered truly novel, Bravo, with a few as a real advantage, while others may offer an advantage or can be possibly helpful. But they are Me Too drugs. What do you mean by Me Too drugs? It means that they already exist in the market. All right, so patents make accessibility an issue, especially in LMICs. Patents do not help in responding to and promoting the production of drugs that address the greatest needs of populations in LMICs. And patents don't even promote novelty, which is the very purpose of patents in the first place. Right. So now, just to further hammer down on the effects of patents on drug pricing, we have this example, the cancer drug Gleevec. demonstrates the huge differences between a monopoly and generic price. South Africa pays over 3,227 US dollars per patient per month for the branded products. In India, where the patent was not granted, the drug is priced at 170 US dollars for a month's treatment. So immediately see the distinction, the price distinction. One is with a patent and the other is without. Although Novartis's expenditure on the development of its cancer drug Gleevec is estimated to be around, from 38 to 96 million US dollars, it made a staggering 4.675 billion in sales in 2012. So as you can see, um, it, it has several folds multiplied um, uh, uh, the money invested on this product. And because patent's able to do that. And again, looking into more examples, in 1999, the 3 drug cocktails to treat HIV cost 10 to 15 US dollars. Today, thanks to generic competition, these medicines are available for only 140 US dollars. So now, because there's no more patent to these drug cocktails, prices dramatically went down, and which clearly demonstrates to us how patent affects prices. Um, Now, um, patent is patent is really causing several issues when it comes to access to medicines. Now, there's several strategies put forward to improve access to medicines, such as, for example, private donations. Though private donations would be something like charity, and we cannot depend on charity to address a real societal need. Addressing access to medicines must be systematic and systemic. It can't be dependent on charity, right? So it is so private donations may be an access strategy, but that can't be that can't be the state strategy. Okay, there's also compulsory licensing, which we saw. Though we also somehow discussed the restrictions of the use of compulsory licensing. We also look into parallel importing and also look into the restrictions of parallel importing, which is the same as the restrictions of compulsory licensing. There can also be price reductions and differential pricing, meaning that prices in low income countries are different, ideally lower than prices in high income countries. But then you see pharma companies are not very keen on using this option. And of course, there are international collaborative initiatives and public-private partnerships. So the Global Fund and during the COVID pandemic, there was, for example, the COVAX facility, right? There's also this drive towards a medicines patent pool, where patent holders voluntarily give up their patents to the patent pool. And then the medicines patent pool sublicenses the patents to generic manufacturers, so which allows for faster but also cheaper drugs. At the same time, without neglecting royalties being given to the original patent holders. Now, in spite of all these possibilities or efforts to improve access to medicines, as you can see, none of them have achieved a little. None of them are really systematic, in the sense that they are integral to how medicines are accessed or medicines are made available in a country, right? So despite some positive achievements, high prices of new drugs, are still the norm, especially in emerging markets. The use of TRIPS flexibilities remain exceptional, means it only happens in exceptional situations, and policy space to ensure access to health-related knowledge and to protect health within the trade and intellectual property regimes is under threat. I would want to end by giving the example of COVID. So, as you know, in October 2020, India and South Africa proposed a waiver from certain TRIPS provisions. But then this proposal was not widely supported. Instead, in June 2020, the WTO ministerial decision was for a limited waiving of patent rights and COVID-19 vaccines, limited only to vaccines, as there's no concurrent agreement to share the know-how or technology necessary for actually manufacture vaccines. So it was a limited product patent, and it was not a waiving at all, a limited product patent only to vaccines, and there was no waiving of process patents. Well, and yeah, just to show you the state of affairs as of March 2023, if we track the share of population receiving at least one dose, we can see that one continent is really suffering from not having even one dose of COVID vaccines, and that is Africa. Right? We see a lot of brown and beige. And the same things, and it's the same story if we look at the share of population fully vaccinated. You see full vaccinations everywhere else except for this African region and some regions in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. All right, so I hope this contributes to further discussions. Thank you.